Hi, this is Misha. In this video, we're going to be looking at the early smokeless powder repeating bolt action rifles used by various militaries from Europe, North America, and a little bit into Asia. We don't really think about it today, but smokeless powder was a huge revolution in the late 19th century. Before that, black powder had been used for centuries, and it had a lot of negatives. For one thing, it fouled and rusted very quickly. It didn't really produce a hell of a lot of velocity and all of that, not for what you got. And of course, it did produce a lot of smoke, which obscured battlefields in the 19th century and before. So when smokeless powder came along, it really was a revolution. It all kind of began in 1882 when Colonel Rubin in Switzerland started to develop the small diameter bullet. These would be copper jacketed lead core bullets, and he would do a couple of different styles, mostly in 8mm and 7.5mm. Well, a short time later, smokeless powder would be invented. It was originally called powder B in France, but it was basically paracellulose, which was a type of gun cotton mixed with ether, alcohol, and it was an early smokeless powder. Then in 1887, from inventions from Lebel, they would be modified into what we know today as cordite, which is what would be used for quite a long time in a lot of smokeless powder guns. Smokeless powder had quite a few benefits. As previously mentioned, unlike black powder, it did not produce as much smoke, although it did produce some smoke, of course, but compared to black powder, it was virtually none. It was about 3 times more powerful, meaning they could use less powder and still get higher velocities, better range, better accuracy, so on and so forth. It was also, it didn't foul the pieces up as much. Although, of course, the early ones were still corrosive, it was nothing like black powder. Anyone who owns a black powder, a musket out there, knows how corrosive black powder can be. So that was kind of the brief how things got going. And the first nation to field in the military, officially adopt in the military, a smokeless powder rifle would be France with the 1886 Lebel. Now, to be fair, Colonel Lebel was the one who developed the 8x50 cartridge. It was a rimmed cartridge, kind of had a pretty sharp bottleneck to it. The rifle itself was designed by committee in France, and it shows. This is a combination of a lot of old and a few new concepts. We have a very long 31-inch barrel. This gun is over 51 inches long total, and it weighs about 9.5 pounds. Well, about 9.25 pounds, I should say. It has quite a few holdovers from the old musket days. For one, this trigger is very straight. It always reminds me of kind of an old matchlock trigger from the 18th century, the way it's designed. We have a turn bolt, but as you see, it's not a very common shape by today's standards. This does not have a vertical magazine. Rather, it has a tube running under the barrel. It holds 8 cartridges in the tube, plus 1 on the elevator here, and then you can have a 10th one in the chamber. So it's an 8 plus 1 capacity. It loads from here, onto the elevator, kick it up. We also have a magazine feed cutoff here. You might think that's a safety. It is not. There is no safety on this gun. When you have that engaged, the elevator is stuck in the up position, making this a single shot, holding the 8-round magazine in reserve. This has no upper handguard. That was part of the design. It takes a cruciform, a spike bayonet, kind of a socket type. Have a stacking rod, sling swivels. The sights on this are very fine, very small, which would definitely lead to some issues in World War I. Typical ladder sights. And we have a very nicely machined receiver. Actually, this receiver was insanely overbuilt for firing the 8x50 Lebel cartridge. Even though this was the first smokeless powder cartridge, it really was very weak by World War I standards when most of these guns saw service. And the Lebel would be the primary infantry rifle of France during World War I and beyond, really. They would manufacture these until 1920. They would build about 2.9 million total. So these would remain in service in France until 1940, officially, and then they would be used in the hands of partisans fighting the Nazis throughout World War II, finally retired afterwards. Definitely the longest serving of the original early bolt-action smokeless powder rifles. The cartridge was revolutionary, but the gun itself was quite traditional. Another issue that these had, that would plague a lot of early smokeless powder guns, for sure, was that the magazine tube was quite slow to reload, because you could not use chargers, clips, and there was really no way to make it that happen. Also, because it was a tube fed, they would have trouble later once the Spitzer cartridge began to appear after 1901, 1902, because of having pointed bullet tips poking into primers. But that's really a story for another day. The main point here is that France was the first to field a smokeless powder gun, and that started a revolution, if not necessarily a crisis, throughout Europe. At the time, France's #1 adversary was Germany. And when they heard that France had adopted a smokeless powder gun, which basically the cartridge made every other black powder gun used in Europe at the time obsolete overnight, Germany scrambled to come up with a response. And that's where the 1888 Gewehr 1888 so-called commission rifle came from. Now, to be honest, this is an 8805, which was reworked later to fire the updated 8mm Mauser Spitzer cartridge before World War I, but it is an original rifle dating back to the 1890s. What's interesting, this fires the 8x57 round, and unlike the 8x50 rimmed round of the Lebel, this was a rimless cartridge. So only 2 years after France had adopted their cartridge, Germany had gone to a rimless round, which, as we all know today, ended up being the future. Originally, these would be packet-fed vertically, using Mannlicher style in-block clips holding 5 rounds, which is another advantage over the time. We have a bolt action pretty much lifted off the Mauser 1871 and updated a little bit. We have a slightly shorter 29-inch barrel with this large sheet metal shroud around it. We have a side bayonet mount, cleaning rod. We have better sights than the Lebel. A little larger, easier to use, but still pretty fine by today's standards. Still no upper handguard. Full length wood stock now. The commission rifle would have its own issues, and we've got a video on the development of the Mauser that really goes more into detail about this gun. The main thing is this was Germany's response to France, and they really got it into service quickly. It was really a rush job, and it shows in some of the later details. That's why it was only in frontline service for about a decade before being replaced by the Mauser Model 98 pattern guns. That said, it does have a few advantages over the Lebel, as we've already pointed out. It is a little bit shorter. It's about 49 inches long. And it is lighter. It's about 8.5 pounds versus 9.25 pounds compared to the Lebel. It is faster to load, although it holds fewer rounds. So it's kind of a trade-off, although I think I'd still rather go with this system because you go through 8 rounds or 10 rounds even in combat with the Lebel quite quickly, whereas this you just can keep topping off with Mannlicher M-block clips. So I think I would go that avenue myself. And although these would only be in frontline service until the very early 20th century in Germany, they were reworked to fire the newer 8mm Mauser Spitzer cartridge beginning around 1905, and they would see quite heavy use in the early days of World War I, before they had enough Mausers to really suit their needs. As I first mentioned, one of the main developments that led to the smokeless powder cartridge happened in Switzerland with Colonel Rubin, who developed the small diameter, and that led to this rifle here. This is the model 1889 Schmidt-Rubin, chambered for 7.5 by 53 GP90. This would be designed in 1889, and it would be adopted around 1890-1891 by the Swiss military. And it is quite different from the first two we've looked at. We are going back to a longer barrel. We're at about 51 inches again, maybe 50 and a half. We're back up, excuse me, not 51 inches for the barrel, sorry, I'm talking about the overall length of the gun. The barrel is at about 30-31 inches. The overall gun is about 50-51 inches. So we're kind of long like the Lebel. Because of the different action and receiver and magazine, we're heavier. We're just a smidge under 10 pounds with this critter. We have a semi-fixed 12-round magazine. It can be removed for cleaning, but it was really meant to be left in the gun. We have a mag feed cutoff here. And as you saw, we have a straight pull system. Now, unlike the Lebel, we do have a safety here, this ring. You just pull it and rotate it. That both safes the gun and decocks it, which is a really good idea. And then when you need to use it, just pull it back out and rotate it back, and you're cocked again. This would begin the whole series of Swiss straight pull guns, including all the Schmidt-Rubins and the later K31. And while it is heavy, it is very accurate for its day and time, although the GP90 cartridge is quite a bit weaker than the later GP11 that most are familiar with. We have an interesting rear sight. You press this button here and you can move it up and down with one hand, which is pretty good, although maybe not the strongest sight in the world. We have a full-length handguard, which is a nice addition. We have an open front sight still, stacking rod. We have a very traditional bayonet lug. Have a very nicely machined receiver with lightning cuts to reduce as much weight as possible. Very nice Swiss trigger. And again, we have this straight pull system. And this would end up being kind of the fault of this gun. As you can see here, the locking lugs are very much towards the rear of the bolt. This would harm accuracy and not make it as strong as it could have been. So a very short time later, as early as 1895, work would begin on making a stronger version of this rifle. Now, really all they had to do was move the locking lugs to the middle of the bolt, and that helped a lot. But that's a story for another day. We have a full Swiss video on the evolution. But as a first attempt at a smokeless powder rifle, it was quite good. It was designed by Schmidt and Rubin. Schmidt designed the action. Rubin designed the 7.5 GP90 cartridge. They would produce these until about 1896, and they would make 212,000, give or take. These would be pulled out of frontline service pretty quickly, although it took a little time because they were having to phase in the newer 1896 models firing with the relocated bolt lugs, and then later they would recall those and replace them into the 9611s and put these back in the field temporarily just to give the soldiers something. You can shoot GP11 in these a couple of times, but the cartridge is too hot for this action, so they only authorize the use of GP11 in the 1889 Schmidt-Rubin as a last-ditch emergency because it would destroy the gun. Even firing GP90, they would have trouble with the locking lugs cracking or even shearing off. So they had issues, but you know, it really shows what was going to come in Switzerland. And since Rubin was instrumental in designing their smokeless cartridge anyway, it was kind of neat that Switzerland got in on the game very early. And of course, their stance of neutrality meant that it wasn't really used in combat so much, but it was definitely a good deterrence gun. Also, another early adopter of smokeless powder was Japan. This is the Type 22 Murata. It was adopted in Japan in 1889 and was kind of the culmination of the entire Murata series. The Murata would begin with the Type 13 in black powder and the Type 18, which was an improved. Both fired the 11x60 rimmed black powder cartridge. This would fire Japan's first smokeless powder cartridge. It would be 8x53 rimmed, and it would really only be used in the Murata. And maybe a machine gun or two, but for the most part just the Murata, because it would quickly be replaced by the Arisaka Type 30. It was inspired in large part by the German Mauser Model 71, also by the French Graz to some extent. Like the French Lebel, we have an underbarrel tube magazine with an elevator. The tube runs all the way out to here. This is the end of the tube. It also is where the bayonet ring mounts, which is kind of neat. We have a very long barrel here. It's about 31 inches. Have a relatively long gun to go with at about 50 inches. And this weighs about 9 pounds, so pretty typical for that era. As I said, we've got a magazine tube under the barrel. We also have a feed cutoff, much like the Lebel. So the feed system was very much inspired by the Graz and the Lebel. We do have a more modern bolt system compared to the Lebel, though, more like on the Mauser. Bowl. The trigger is curved, has a rather elegant shape to it. Pretty small trigger guard, though. Nice trigger. Rather than having a cleaning rod under the barrel, we have a storage compartment in the buttstock here for a sectional cleaning rod. No one knows exactly how many of these were made, but estimates range from 400 to 500,000. So relatively large number, but not massive for that day and time. The problem is sometimes the numbers for the Type 13 and Type 18 get folded into these too, so that might be including all Muratas. But again, adopted in 1889, and already by 1897 this would be phased out in favor of the Type 30 Arisaka firing 6.5 millimeter. Really its only combat use, at least active combat use, was in the Russo-Japanese War, 1904. And even then it was already a second line type gun. By World War I and definitely by World War II, these were second line, if not completely retired out. But it does show you that Japan was on the cutting forefront of military technology in the late 19th century. They had been trying to modernize and catch up with the European powers for 25 years at that point, and doing a very good job of it. Even though this took inspiration from various guns, it was a wholly Japanese domestic design with some unique Japanese twists and flares. The manufacturing quality is very good too for a country that was just getting its manufacturing programs up and running. The Type 13 Murata was actually the first domestically designed rifle ever. Before that, they were purchasing guns from Europe mostly. But yeah, the Japanese Type 22, 1889 Murata. We'll move on. Moving on, we have a rifle that in some respects I shouldn't even include in this series. One of my criteria, I was trying to pick rifles that were designed specifically to fire smokeless powder. And the British Lee-Enfield originally really wasn't, sort of. It has a very interesting story, and it has to be included because the British would use essentially the same action all the way through World War II and even Korea. The Lee-Enfield had its roots in the 1880s, still during the era of black powder. The action was a rear locking bolt with the lugs in the back here, designed by James Paris Lee, and it was to be mated with a barrel that had Metford rifling. Now, Metford rifling was a shallow type of rifling designed for black powder. The idea was it would not, the fouling would not adhere to it as easily. It would be easier to clean out. So the idea was to make it easier to clean black powder fouling out. As mentioned, black powder is really bad about that. To go along with the new rifle system, Britain was developing a .303 cartridge, which was 7.7 by 56 rimmed, and again, it was to be black powder. Tests were, they started working on this, testing it. They had prototypes by 1884, 1885, and they were about ready to go into full-scale production. Then France introduced the Lebel. Obviously, they weren't about to adopt and put into full production a rifle that was technically already obsolete. At the same time, they had invested a lot in it, and they did not want to go back to the drawing board completely. So in 1888, they reworked the .303 cartridge and filled it with smokeless powder, and they used basically the same Lee Metford gun. The original Mark I Lee Metford would have a standard single stack vertical 8-round magazine, also designed by James Paris Lee. It would be removable, like on this later gun, and a few other early features. It would quickly become the Mark II in 1894, Lee Metford, but they were already having problems. The Mark II would introduce this now standard 10-round double stack mag, also designed by Lee. Interestingly, it was removable, but chained to the gun. They would issue a second mag to troops to use in an emergency, but since this has a mag feed cutoff, the idea was to single shot, saving both magazines for emergencies. The Lee Metford rifling, or I should say the Metford rifling, excuse me, was fine for black powder, but because it was shallow, it wore out very quickly while firing the .303 smokeless powder cartridge. Even though .303 wasn't especially high pressure, it did wear the Metford rifling out, and that's where the Lee-Enfield comes into the scene in 1895. They took the Mark II Lee Metford and they put a new rifled barrel made at the Enfield Royal Small Arms Factory, Enfield, and it would have deeper, more squared off rifling specifically designed for smokeless powder. This is why the Lee-Metford Mark II and the Lee-Enfield Mark I look the same, because the difference is internal to the bore. Otherwise, we have pretty much the same features. We have a 30-inch and some change barrel. We have a pretty interesting sticky Eddie bayonet lug. Takes the P88 bayonet. We have not really a cleaning rod under the barrel. Again, this rifle began in the black powder days. This was originally meant to be a clearing rod if you had something in your barrel. We have a stacking swivel here. We have a short, very short, upper handguard. We have pretty mediocre sights, honestly. They're just kind of friction adjustable, not really held in. The slide, I mean. We have a dust cover over the action to help protect it. We cannot be topped off by stripper clips yet. We're still just single feeding or using the magazine. And we have the safety located actually on the cocking piece here, which is kind of different by today's standards. There it is. The idea was you had it on safe there, you reached up, and we're ready to go. Also, quite famously, these guns originally had volley sights, rear and front. And these would go out to some pretty incredible distances. Now, to be fair, they were for massed infantry volley fire, not individual fire. So it had some use. We have a storage compartment in the buttstock for the rest of the cleaning gear. Again, the rod under the barrel is just a clearing rod, not a cleaning rod. So we usually have a rope pull through and an oiler in here. What was happening after smokeless powder was first released, there was kind of an arms race for accuracy, distance, range. The new cartridge was supposed to be so much better at all those things that countries are trying to get the rifle to shoot as long and as far as possible with accuracy. That's why you're seeing all these long barrels on these guns. Britain took the Lee-Enfield and even some of the older Lee-Metfords into combat in 1898, 1899 during the Boer War, and pretty much had their asses handed to them by Mausers that were being used. This really made them rethink the system. This is why this model of so-called long Enfield, or officially magazine Lee-Enfield MLE Mark I, was in production and frontline service for such a short period of time. Not only did the Mauser firing its 7mm cartridge outrange it and out-accuracy it, it could also be topped off using chargers in British speak, or stripper clips for the rest of us, whereas this version of the Enfield could not. So as soon as Britain returned from the Boer War in 1900, they set about revamping the Enfield. In the end, they would pretty much retain this action. They would adapt it to feed from chargers. They would pretty much keep this type of magazine though, and they would shorten it up. So the long Lee was only in production until about 1902. They only produced them for about 7-8 years, plus the Metfords before it. Now, what makes it kind of confusing to say how many were made and this and that, Britain had a habit, a very good habit by economy, of taking older guns and reworking them to newer patterns. So some of the older Lee-Metfords were rebarreled to Lee-Enfields, and some MLEs, long rifles, and even carbines were reworked into the later SMLE, short magazine Lee-Enfield, the short rifle of World War I fame. So you'll see some older receivers, and a lot of these were also converted over into 22 trainers. We had one in the store a couple of months ago. It was really neat. It was actually a Lee-Metford made in 1894, I believe. and it had been reworked to 22. So it's kind of neat they were using these. And it's also just interesting that this began as a black powder gun, and they were able to carry the action over all the way to the number 4 Mark I and number 5 jungle carbine all the way into and past World War II. This is also why, since the locking lugs are in the rear, when firing just the .303 cartridge, the Lee-Enfield is really operating at the edge of its envelope. It's strong enough, but just barely. A lot of these other guns are pretty overbuilt, like the Lebel. So Britain was in there too. A bit of a rocky start was. Stay there. Speaking of rocky starts, we have another gun from France. This is an 1892 Berthier carbine. Now the rest of these rifles out today are long rifles, as you can tell, because that's what was adopted. But this was originally adopted as a carbine. Later it would be extended into a full-length rifle for World War I and before. But originally it was a carbine. And the reason was the Lebel, while it served fine as a long rifle for France, they could not really cut it down into a carbine and get what they wanted out of it for cavalry and other use. In the end, they went to a completely different design. Designed by an engineer, Berthier, and around 1888, 1889, this went through trials and was first adopted in 1890 as a cavalry carbine. Then a slightly improved version, this one here, would be adopted as the 1892. They would have a few different versions. Actually, they'd have quite a few versions of the Berthier over the years. Unlike the Lebel, we have a turn-down bolt. The locking lugs are located differently. They lock vertically versus horizontally on the Lebel. We have a full-length stock. And most importantly, we have a vertical magazine. It only holds 3 rounds, but it's topped off by packets or chargers or end blocks. This used, again, a Mannlicher style end block clip, much like the original German commission rifle, which had been adopted just a couple years before this gun. And even though it held 3 rounds, once they were done shooting those 3 rounds, they could just take another packet and cram it in there very quickly. This was especially advantageous for people on horseback that only had a free second or two. So while it held significantly fewer cartridges than the Berthier, it could be reloaded much, much faster. And they could have rounds already ready to go in clips. It was also much, much lighter. They were able to get this thing down to about 37 inches and some change overall, with about a 17.8 barrel. And we're weighing less than 7 pounds. We're about 6 3/4 pounds for this whole gun. So it's a much lighter, handier gun than the Lebel. And it's mechanically a different system. These are actually faster and cheaper to produce than the Lebel, which was nice. They are very popular with cavalry troops, at least compared to the Lebels of the day. And they would remain in production all the way through World War I in various forms. They would eventually introduce a 5-round magazine to give it a little more firepower, and they would introduce an upper handguard eventually to protect against the heat from the barrel. Now, a few things. This has a very similar sight system to the Lebel. And we still have kind of that, what I think of as a matchlock type straight trigger to the Lebel. But I thought that was interesting that instead of going to Lebel carbine, they had to go to a completely different design in France to have a carbine. It is worth noting, before anyone points it out, that yes, eventually they would do the R35 carbine, but that's a story for a different day. Next up, we have a gun that really needs no introduction. This is the original 1891 Mosin-Nagant. Although in Russia it's usually just called the Mosin rifle. Now this version was made in 1915 in World War I. It's a little different from the original version introduced in the sense that it has the sling slots versus the swivels, and it does have an upper handguard, but minor differences. This is a long gun. It has a 31.5-inch barrel. We're at nearly 52 inches long, and we're weighing about 9.5 pounds. So not a light gun or a short gun by any stretch of the imagination. Seeing all the other European nations going to smokeless powder, Imperial Russia, of course, wanted to do the same. They did not have the funding or really even the infrastructure to manufacture, though. So they had a design competition in 1891, and two designers' designs really kind of came to the fore. Nagant, who was from Belgium, and Captain Mosin of Russia. They would mostly use the Mosin system, bolt action, but they would more or less copy the magazine system from the Nagant rifle. This led to some minor infighting, but they were able to resolve things, giving Nagant some credit. And by 1895, he was back to liking Russia and ended up, submitting his revolver. That's another story. But, there was a little bit of controversy, but in the end, they kind of took the best elements of both and created this gun. It is simple. We have a front locking bolt, 2 lugs. Very standard. We have a safety back here, which is pretty sucky, but it was really only meant to be used if you were marching with a loaded gun, climbing fences, climbing mountains, getting in and out of vehicles, whatever. It wasn't really meant to be taken on and off often as a safety would today. We have a vertical magazine holding 5 cartridges. It can be topped by stripper clips. It's one of the first military guns to accept a stripper clip. The very first was actually the 1889 Mauser used in Belgium, but this would carry that over very early and be used by major power. So even though we have a single stack gun, we're using chargers now. It fired a 7.62 by 54 rimmed cartridge. So like Britain and France, it was still using the older rimmed pattern. It had not gone to this rimless like Germany yet, but so it goes. Trigger system is simple and dependable, if not always the best feeling, although this one's nice. It's just old. We have very standard sights. They're adjustable. Quite good for the day, if a little bit delicate by Russian standards. We have a full-length cleaning rod under the barrel. And we take a socket-style bayonet that clips on behind the rear front sight. And we have an unprotected front sight. Now again, this is the original 1891. I would assume most folks are more familiar with the 9130 of World War II fame, which is about 3 inches shorter and a little bit lighter and has different sights. But this is the original version used in World War I. This gun would, this action would pretty much remain unchanged all the way through the 50s. Even when they would go to the carbines later, they would pretty much use the same Mosin bolt action system all the way through the end of production. So it was in production for a long time. The first guns were actually made in France for Russia because they did not have the infrastructure to build them themselves. They were still setting up production. And it would begin at Izhevsk and Tula in around 1894, 1895. And they would keep producing them in huge numbers, vast numbers. I mean, they made 17 million Enfields. They made, I don't even know, I don't think anyone knows for sure, 25, 30 million Mosins across the world, even more. And like the Enfields, they would often take older guns, rework them. Russia would, Finland would, other countries as well. But very popular gun, dependable, reliable as all get out. Pretty accurate, not the most accurate of the day, but more than accurate, more than sufficient enough. A lot of history. and it worked. Simple, relatively inexpensive to produce, and that's why it would stay in service for such a long period of time. And of course we have a full video on the Mosin-Nagant too. And right at the same time, Italy would get in on the game. We have the 1891 Carcano. Now, Italy looked around Europe, saw what everyone else was doing, Germany, France, Belgium, and they basically took the best elements of each rifle and came up with the Carcano. Now, it was named after the chief technician at the Turin Arsenal, Carcano obviously, but really it was just kind of borrowing heavily, if not outright stealing, from the best concepts of the day. We have a bolt that is very similar to that Mosin-Nagant. Simple, dependable, straightforward. The safety's improved, I would say. We have a safety here, you just press in. And what's nice when you put it on safe, you can also, when you're taking the spring pressure off, you can decock it, which is handy. Well, if I get the bolt in the right way, huh? You see a problem with that. Sometimes the bolt likes to come up. There we go. And then you can just pull the trigger and there's no spring tension. So the safety is definitely an improvement, although the bolt system, and it uses a decocker as well, is very much like the Mosin-Nagant. Pretty typical trigger. Not horrible, not great. We're using a Mannlicher style magazine. It uses in-block clips. This holds 6 rounds of 6.5 millimeter Carcano, which is 6 by 52. Italy was kind of at the ahead of the curve there. They were the first major nation to adopt such a small diameter cartridge, and it would remain one of the smallest diameter cartridges in military service for a brief period of time. We have about a 30.5-inch barrel, overall length of about 50 inches, and we're pretty light. This is about an 8.5-pound gun, so for the day it's quite svelte. It's pretty thin, but also durable. The sights are interesting too. We have a true battle sight here for just quick use, and then we have a fully adjustable ladder here, very similar in concept to that Swiss sight you saw. You can press it with one hand and move it up and down, and then when you release it, locks into position. And then if you don't need it, it folds into a cutout in the stock. We do have an upper hand guard, not a huge one, but we have one at least. We take a very typical knife bayonet. We have a thin but usable cleaning rod under the barrel here. Unprotected front sight, pretty common for the era. Straight stock. Very typical gun in a lot of ways, but still a very good gun. It served Italy very well during World War I and after. After World War I, a lot of these long rifles would be cut down into carbines by the Mussolini government. They would be called the 9124. But yeah, this was a standard issue rifle in Italy during World War I, with its probably biggest thing being its 6.5 millimeter cartridge. Oh yes, about the cartridge again. It was a rimless cartridge, much like the German 8 millimeter. So the cartridge itself was actually very advanced for the day, probably the rifle's biggest thing. Also using the Mannlicher packet in-block system was quite good. It held 6 cartridges. These were a lot like the Mosin, not spectacularly accurate, but very durable, very reliable, and above all for Italy, who was also pretty cash-strapped, inexpensive to produce. We'll move on. Not to be outdone by Europe, America also got into the smokeless powder game, of course. Sort of. This is actually an 1896 Krag-Jorgensen, but it began with the 1892. America would hold trials in that year, and several designers from North America and Europe would submit designs. In the end, a Norwegian design by Krag-Jorgensen would be selected, and it would go into production at the Springfield Arsenal. Now, it would take a couple of years to set up the production line because it required all new tooling, and the first 1892s would be turned out in 1894. And then in 1896, they would introduce this slightly improved version with a stronger stock, better sights, and they would remove the cleaning rod from under the barrel. Minor little things. The Krag is an interesting gun. Typical turn bolt. We have a turn down handle as well, or angled down, I should say. Now, this only has a single locking lug, which you can see here. This made the action very smooth, but also not very strong. It fired a .30 caliber U.S. Army cartridge, which was America's first smokeless powder issue cartridge, often called 30-40 Krag. And it fed from this semi-half-circle style magazine where you would dump 5 cartridges in and then close it up. It also had a feed cutoff on the side here. So you could single shot if you needed to. We have a very exposed cocking piece. It's nice. This was an interesting gun for America, and it did not stay in frontline service for long. In fact, it was the shortest lived standard issue, general issue rifle in American history, at least up to this point. While the action was smooth, it was weak. The .30 caliber cartridge, while an improvement over older black powder rounds, wasn't a significant improvement, but the main issue was this magazine. Much like the Lee-Enfield, it really couldn't be topped off by stripper clips, chargers, so you had to single load. We have a 30-inch barrel. Overall, we have about a 50 and some change inch rifle. And we're weighing in at about 9 1/3 pounds. Not heavy, not light. It's a pretty svelte gun all in all, but still has some weight and length to it. Typical sights for the era. Maybe, if I can get them up. See? They're not great. There we go, come on. You unscrew this, slide it up, and then screw it back down at the range you want. Again, not really a great design, as they came to find out. Unprotected front sight. As I said, the original 1892 version would have a cleaning rod under the barrel. They would move this to a cleaning kit stored in the buttstock with later versions. Typical knife bayonet, typical stacking swivel, unprotected front sight, typical for the day short upper handguard, although this one is longer than others. They would take these into combat during the Spanish-American War in 1898, and again, much like the Lee-Enfield, they would get owned by the 1893 Mauser used by Spain, which was firing the 7mm cartridge. Better range, better accuracy, but most importantly, could easily and quickly be topped off by stripper clips. This was becoming a very important thing. So after that war, basically this gun's days were already numbered. They immediately went to work at the Springfield Arsenal, developing what would become the 1903 based on the Mauser, and the Krag would be out of production by 1904. They would start to pull these out of frontline service by 1907, and by World War I, very few were left in real service. Most of them were just given to reservists or set as second line type things. They would produce about 500,000, about 500,000, so quite a large number. But again, adopted in 1892, in production in 1894 and already out of production by 1904 and out of service by 1907. Nice gun, but since, of course, this bolt was pretty weak, they couldn't upgrade the cartridge. They were pretty much stuck with the 30 caliber Krag cartridge, and they needed something more powerful. So that was America's first attempt at smokeless powder with a Norwegian design, and it was pretty honestly unsuccessful, all things told. Now that said, for a civilian just shooting, they're a joy to shoot. They really are. Now while we're talking about the first generation of smokeless powder, I figured it'd be fun to bring out the Winchester 1895. This is the musket model. Designed by John Browning. This was the first lever action gun to be created specifically for smokeless powder cartridges. And it was created with this vertical 5-round box magazine so it could use pointed cartridges such as the Spitzer. It was also the last lever action that Browning designed for Winchester. Has a lot of traditional Winchester lever features. We have an exposed hammer here. Like Winchester muskets dating back to just after the Civil War, we have a 28-inch barrel with a long forearm, bayonet lug, stacking swivel, sling swivel. Pretty typical musket style rear sights. Adjustable. Relatively long upper handguard for the day. And a storage compartment in the buttstock for cleaning kit. And we have kind of a curved metal butt plate with the second sling swivel. Actually, this one's detachable, which is kind of neat. Quick detachable. These were primarily designed for the commercial market. However, during the Spanish-American War, the U.S. military would order 10,000 in 30-40 Krag for use. The Rough Riders would use these, but the rest would not make it to theater in time for that war. A lot of those would end up in Cuba and Mexico afterwards. But then during World War I, the Russian government, needing as many guns as it could, made a large purchase order. They ultimately ended up making just under 300,000 for Imperial Russia. Now, not all of these were sent to Russia, and of those, not all of those were accepted by Russia because they had overly picky inspectors. But quite a few were used by Russia in World War I. And you would think with all this exposed action, this wouldn't do great in the trenches. But it actually did pretty well. Better than you'd think, at least. Russia would keep these in service through the 20s, and they would give several thousand to the Republican Spanish during their Civil War in 1936. Also, quite a few were captured or left in Finland after their independence. So the Russian contract 1895 musket got around. It appeared in some odd places, and it's an interesting gun because you just do not see many lever action military rifles firing smokeless powder. This did fire, of course, this particular version, the 7.62 by 54 rimmed cartridge used by Russia. It is fed by Mosin-Nagant stripper clips. It does take a proprietary Winchester bayonet. Like I said, it has a 28-inch barrel like most of Winchester's muskets. That means it has an overall length of about 46 inches. So for the day, it's pretty short. Definitely shorter than the Mosin-Nagant by a good bit. On the other hand, because of this very large receiver, it's pretty heavy. We're weighing in here at over 9 pounds. So for its size and how skinny it looks, it's actually pretty heavy. But at least most of the weight is here in the center. It's not front heavy. So the balance is quite nice. And it feels really good. Smooth gun. But yeah, used in small numbers by America and by Russia in World War I. And really was the first lever action to be designed specifically for smokeless powder. Oh, come on, don't be that mean. Okay, there we go. Moving on, we have the Steyr-Mannlicher 1895. This was the standard issue gun used in Austria beginning in 1895, and they would keep producing them through 1918 and issuing them through really World War II. We've talked quite a bit about Mannlicher throughout this video and his contributions for other guns. This gun here, the 1895, was the first full smokeless powder rifle adopted and issued by Austria, but it had a long lineage. It used Mannlicher's in-block clip system, of course. Come on. Did I save it? No, just stiff. There we go. This holds 5 rounds, topped off by Mannlicher clips. This system would begin in 1885 with the black powder Mannlichers, and he would work on his straight pull system through 1888, which used kind of a falling wedge lockup. And then in 1890, he would introduce a straight pull bolt system with a rotating bolt with 2 lugs. This was his strongest system, and it was strong enough to handle smokeless powder. The prior wedge systems, they had what many call a semi-smokeless cartridge used in them in the 1888-90. But it really wasn't until the 1890 carbine and the 1895 rifle, this one here, that they went to a full smokeless powder 8x50 rimmed cartridge. Pretty typical gun for the day. Have a 31-inch barrel. Again, overall length like everyone else of about 50 inches and some change. We're weighing in about the same. We're a little bit lighter than some. We're about 9 pounds. It's a pretty svelte, well-balanced gun, really is. And it did its job well. Much like the Carcano and the Mosin-Nagant, it wasn't the most accurate gun on the planet with the best trigger, but it was dependable, reliable in the grime and the dirt, especially for a straight pull. And it was relatively inexpensive to produce. This would be produced at Steyr in Austria and FEG, or what would become FEG, in Hungary during the war. Now after the war, although production would end in 1918, they would retrofit a lot of these to fire a newer 8x56 Spitzer cartridge in 1931 and beyond. So most of the ones you find, including this one, have been reworked to fire the newer updated cartridge, which is good because trying to find the original Steyr 8x50 cartridge is near impossible. Just to let you know, even though it's very similar in dimensions to the Lebel cartridge, it's not at all interchangeable. But yeah, the straight pull system is probably the most unique part about this gun. We do have a safety over here that locks the bolt in either position, cocked or uncocked here. That's about it. Very typical sights for the day. Ladder sight. I mean, it's just, you know, the bolt system is the most unique. It is nice to see that it does have virtually a full-length wood handguard to protect against the barrel's heat. Typical bayonet lug. We have a stacking rod here. No cleaning rod under the barrel. Unprotected front sight. No storage in the butt stock either, so we're keeping the cleaning kit on our belt. Typical sling swivels for an infantry rifle. And they would produce, I think of the right number, well over 1 million. I think it's about 1.5 million of these total. And a lot of them were later cut down to short rifles, carbines. So a lot of the long rifles don't exist today. And just for completeness' sake, let's talk briefly about the infamous Canadian Ross 1905, also known as the Mark II. Like the Steyr, this is a rotating head straight pull with the lugs in the front. We have a 28-inch barrel with an overall length of just under 49 inches, so a little shorter and smaller than a lot of the other guns. And we're a little lighter too. We're about 8.5 pounds. Now, during the Boer War, Canada tried to negotiate with Britain to produce the Lee-Enfield under license, but Britain wasn't going for it. Canada did not want to be dependent on Britain for all of its guns, so one of its citizens of Scottish origin, Sir Charles Ross, said, "Hey, I've been working on this new smokeless powder rifle for a hunting gun for a little bit. Why don't you try it out? It'll make a good military gun." He gave a huge sales pitch for it. He worked his gun to fire the British .303 cartridge and sent Mark I's for trials in 1903 for the Canadian military. They didn't do well. They had parts breakages. They had some parts that weren't up to spec, essentially, and just all kinds of little things. Again, this was originally designed to be a sporting rifle. Also, Ross had very little experience making guns at the time, so the original Mark I Ross didn't really go much of anywhere. That resulted in the 1905 version, the Mark II, which was tried out 1906, 1907 period, and has a stronger system. For one thing, the bayonet mounting is stronger. Stacking rod, sling swivels, upper handguard. We're starting to see a lot of the same stuff here. Now the rear sight is very adjustable. Again, sporting rifle. We can adjust for windage and elevation with knobs. Unfortunately, that was pretty flimsy by military standards, but was finally adjustable. We have this straight pull system, which was very much inspired by the Steyr-Mannlicher, no matter what Ross may or may not have said. It's very similar in a lot of ways. It's smoother, it's nicer, it's more refined, but then again, that also led to problems with grime and dirt and all that. Now, what's interesting about this gun is the feed system. This is a Harris controlled feed platform system. It holds 5 cartridges in a double stack flush fit mag. You basically press this lever down, dump your cartridges in, and then let off, and then it puts spring tension. As you've noticed, you cannot use stripper clips with this. You have to, jump them in by hand. We know that's a problem. Very nice trigger though, I'll give it that. Also, the safety wasn't great. It's a small button here on the back of the bolt, which could give issues. The Ross is a very interesting gun, but it was never really meant for military use. It was never designed for that, and Ross sold it pretty heavily to the Canadian military, and they bought it because they did not want to be dependent on Britain. This is the 1905, as I said. This is not the version that can infamously have the bolt assembled wrong. It was fine. It actually has an interesting lug system. It uses solid lugs, whereas the one that could be assembled wrong uses kind of a corkscrew type system with interrupted lugs. We have a full video on the Ross, so check that out for more info. But the version was the Mark III and the Mark X. They would manufacture the Mark II, the 1905 version, up into the 19-teens. And then they would also make the Mark III concurrently in the switchover. These would be in frontline military service during World War I, during 1914, 1915. But after that, they were pretty much, especially the Mark IIs, were pulled out for training. Quite a few would be purchased by Britain and America for training rifles, for that matter. You'll see quite a few guns with the U.S. funding bomb property marks. All told, Ross would produce about 425,000 guns, with, again, most all of them going to training units in the end. Canada would officially dump the whole Ross series in 1916. It would see some use by home guard type units in Canada through the 1930s, but it was kind of a failed experiment, and yeah, there's a lot of history there. Again, check out our full video. I just thought it would be kind of neat to include it because this was kind of the last of the first generation of military rifles chambered for smokeless powder. And like a lot of the rest of these, it really wasn't in service very long. This was really, it wasn't the designer's fault or the rifle's fault. It was just because technology was advancing so quickly in the 1880s, 1890s, early 1900s. So you start off with the Lebel, which is really only notable for its cartridge. The rest of the gun is pretty traditional thinking for its time. Then you move on to the commission rifle, which is pretty advanced. We're using the Mauser pattern type bolt. They wouldn't claim so, but Paul Mauser did. He thought it was ripped off from his 1871, and I would agree. It's too similar. It had a few weird features like this barrel shroud, which obviously weren't good, but you know, the rimless cartridge we still use today, 8mm, still a reasonably small cartridge by our standards. Moving over to the Schmidt-Rubin, I mean, that spawned an entire series, even though this particular version wasn't really strong enough for long-time service. The 7.5 cartridge and the GP11 loading is really still in use today by a lot of shooters and was in military use up until the 90s in Switzerland. And the straight pull system itself led to the K31, which we all love. If you don't love the K31, don't watch this channel. Then we move on to the Murata, which is kind of a curiosity. Most people don't think about it today because it was so quickly replaced by the Arasaka. It's mostly interesting, even though its cartridge didn't really go anywhere, for just showing that Japan was at the forefront of technology, and which would ultimately lead to its involvement in World War I and World War II. From there, we have the Lee-Enfield. I mean, what can you say? It's the Enfield. This action has seen so much use, but again, with over 17 million made, it's everywhere. And it's so interesting that it started off as a black powder, and the Brits were able to make it work as a smokeless powder gun through 2 World War Wars plus Korea. The Berthier, again, kind of a forgotten gun by today's standards, more evolved than the Lebel, but still, just the magazine system was its biggest downfall with only 3 cartridges, but it was light and handy. It does have a pretty substantial recoil since it weighs so light too. And of course it's firing the old Lebel cartridge, which doesn't help things. Then the Mosin-Nagant, which we all know. I mean, shoot, the 7.62x54 rimmed cartridge is still in military service, not only in Russia, but in countless other places around the world. Even the Mosin-Nagant, especially as a marksman rifle, might be still in service. If not, it was definitely in service through the 70s before it was replaced by the Dragunov. But I mean, it's just a classic rifle, probably one of the most iconic bolt actions of all time. And it was, again, like the Enfield, the action and magazine and all that was relatively unchanged from the beginning. Then we have the Carcano, which saw a lot of use, a lot of service. Italy got a lot of mileage out of this good gun. It served in World War I and updated versions in World War II. These were surplused out after the war when they went to the Grand and carbine, but it was really notable for its 6.5 rimless cartridge, which really was kind of ahead of its time in some ways. Good, dependable gun that served Italy well and didn't cost them a fortune. The Krag is very famous in America and pretty much nowhere else. Not really much of this gun was carried over. A little bit was to the Springfield 1903, namely the cocking mechanism. But for the most part, the bolt system, the magazine system, which were very interesting concepts for the time, just didn't work out. They weren't strong enough, they weren't flexible enough for the combat of the 20th century. Still, a very nice gun to shoot and a very smooth system, no arguments there. The Winchester 1895. I mean, it's a classic lever action Winchester. I mean, these guns were... Winchester was making lever actions before, during, and after the Civil War, and this is kind of the ultimate culmination. It's about as modern as most lever actions will get. And of course, it was made by Browning, so it's got that going for it. And they are pretty cool. That said, shooting 7.62 by 54 rammed, they will kick the snot out of you. They have pretty substantial recoil. Then moving on to the Steyr 1895. I always thought the straight pull system was neat. These weren't very common in the US for a long time, but then about 10-15 years ago, a large batch of surplus guns came in, and they've become quite common on the American market and very affordable. The only problem is finding the ammo, plus you need the Mannlicher clips. But going out of production in 1918, even though they were still in service through World War II, that was pretty much the end of their legacy. Their cartridge was a little antiquated, 8x50 rimmed. The in-block system gave way to the stripper clip system, which was a better system for military use. But it served Austria well enough during World War I, suited their needs. And then, of course, finally back to the Ross. The Ross is interesting just for its story. It is a very smooth gun with a nice trigger, but it was never meant to be a military gun for the dirt and the trenches of World War I. As a sporting gun, it's fine. In fact, this receiver is very overbuilt. Ross made a couple of different Magnum cartridges for it, and it was strong enough to handle them. It wasn't a weak system, except for maybe extraction, like all straight pulls. But everything else about it just wasn't built military tough. So it saw very brief and even infamous use. But yeah, that's our overview of the early smokeless powder guns. Each of these we have individual videos on and their own history, so if any of them interest you, I would appreciate it if you click that video and check it out. If you have any questions or comments, please post them below. And again, this was a general overview. I know I tried to rush through it, so just trying to get the broad strokes. Really appreciate you tuning in, though. If you like the video, please click. If you haven't already subscribed, I would appreciate it if you do so as well. As always, this is Misha, and while we will never probably be shooting this Lebel on video, we will catch you next time with more hopefully unique and interesting videos. We'll talk to you then.